I think drug user unions are the next generation of what's going to happen in harm reduction and public health to help people keep safe. When you let people have access to technology and just step away and let them figure out what's best for them, I think that's the coolest thing about the drug checking.
We try to get them to understand how it's beneficial to everyone, the whole community at large. People who use drugs, we're not just, addicts or, people on the fringes of society that needs to be thrown away, lepers or whatever. We're human beings, and, we're mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
At Narcotica, we are always emphasizing a few things. 1, drug use is not immoral, far from it, but we do emphasize that you should value your physical and mental health no matter what substances you enjoy or self-medicate with, legal or otherwise. 2, if you buy things off the street or the dark web, you should test your drugs because you have no idea what you're buying and it could hurt or even kill you. Telling people to test their drugs is a little like telling people to wear their seatbelt or brush their teeth. It's boring, it feels like parenting or rule following. Lord knows I have put tons of chemicals in my own body with zero idea of what I took while doling out the advice that people should test their own drugs. Ask me about the time that I ingested LSD and it turned out to be 2,5-I-MBUME. Remember, if it's bitter, it's a spitter. But it was still fun. However, I'm lucky to be alive sometimes. I do test shit way, way more these days, but I get why some people wouldn't want to or might not be able to. Furthermore, it's difficult to test for everything, but at the very least, try to verify it's the chemical you purchased and it doesn't contain fentanyl. You can find tests that'll help with that easily online. On today's episode, we're going to talk about drug testing, but not the tedious ways in which you should do it. There are plenty of great guides out there, which we'll link to in the show notes. Instead, we're going to discuss how drug testing equals empowerment. It's more than just knowing what you may or may not be taking. It's about stepping in where the government has failed and finding autonomy. I'm Troy Farrah, and you're listening to Narcotica. Our guests today are Dr. Nabarun Dasgupta, a pharmacoepidemiologist and scientist at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who helps run the UNC Street Drug Analysis Lab. More info at streetsafe.supply. Also joining us is Charlton Roverson, the Eastern Regional Coordinator with the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition in Fayetteville. Before we get to that, here's a little bit more about this show. Our beautiful website is parked at narcocast.com. You can go there to find more info about us. Like NPR and other podcasts, we are an independent, listener-supported program. We couldn't do this without you. And while I know that sounds like something that every podcast says, it's 100% true, and we are deeply grateful for all of you. Thank you for keeping us on the airwaves for 6 long fucking years. Great. If you want to join a few dozen other people who help keep us on the air, we have a Patreon precisely for that at patreon.com/narcotica. We also have a store at narcocast.myshopify.com with mugs and t-shirts and cool stuff like that. Also, check out our sister podcast, Naturally Non-Compliant, which you can find on iTunes, Spotify, and all your other favorite podcasting platforms. It is a project put together by Aaron Ferguson. It's really great. It's all about methadone and the people who rely on it and are fighting to have access to this life-saving chemical. Again, it's Naturally Non-Compliant. You can check out a bonus episode that we put out recently. It's just a great show. Again, our guests today are Dr. Nabarun Dasgupta, a pharmacoepidemiologist and scientist at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who helps run the UNC Street Drug Analysis Lab. More info at streetsafe.supply. Nab, how are you doing today?
I'm good. It's an honor to be here.
Also with us today is Charlton Roverson, the Eastern Regional Coordinator with the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. How's it going, Charlton?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
And we have Aaron Ferguson, Narcotica's all-around all-star co-producer who's helping co-host today. Aaron, how's it going?
Hey, I'm doing well today, Troy. I'm happy to be here and be able to participate in the interview today.
Yeah, this is a really important topic, one that we've covered a lot on Narcotica about the process of the practice of drug checking, which is something that I didn't do most of my life, but even though I would advocate it for so long, but it's like kind of a basic thing to just kind of know what you're putting in your body. It's a core part of harm reduction, but I think it's more than that, and we're going to talk about that today, about how drug checking can be more about just knowing what's in your supply or what you bought off the street, but it's also about empowerment, and it can give you autonomy, and that's probably why it's opposed by so many institutions, because it does give people who are marginalized more power in society. Nab, let's start with you. I'd really like to get like a rundown. I'm pretty familiar with what you do at the UNC Street Drug Analysis Lab. But for listeners, can you kind of explain the process, how this program got started, and what you hope to accomplish with it?
Sure. The program kind of got its inspirations during the early COVID days, where I was sitting in a COVID PCR drive-through and realized, like, if we can take a swab and put it up our noses and get results back, then why can't we do the same with drugs? So we really built the service around that kind of model. And the way we do it is it's a mail-in service, and so that has its drawbacks and benefits. But what we do is we have a kit that we send to the participating programs, and we have about 160 different programs that we work with around the country. And they can, there's a little vial in the kit that contains a liquid, and they can put in a used cotton, a pinch of a little scoop of a powder, or the swab of the inside of an empty baggie or a pipe, and mail it back to us. We analyze the samples using mass spec and put the results up publicly on a website. So that's the gist of it. And we're in about 35 states around the country and have analyzed about 4,000 samples in the last year and a half.
I guess this is sort of hard to generalize or narrow down, but like, what kind of trends are you seeing? Like, what's the overall scope of things with this program?
Yeah, it's been really fascinating because, I mean, we're seeing pockets of new trends emerge and then some die away. We're seeing Xylazine kind of make its way across the U.S. from the East Coast to the central part of the country, and maybe just a tiny bit showing up on the West Coast here and there. We can also see patterns like the types of benzos that are prevalent in the Pacific Northwest are distinctly different from what we see in other parts of the country. We see certain states like Tennessee have a lot more nitazines in the drug supply than other states. So there's a lot of trends. We see things with how pure methamphetamine is, especially the crystal form, around the country, and so there's, it's been fascinating because having been in the drugs world for 20 years, like, I have had to challenge a lot of my assumptions about what I thought was in the drug supply. And I think the overarching thing, other than crystal meth and crack, is that almost every powder street drug is polysubstance. There's so much other stuff that's in a typical fentanyl or heroin sample these days that, it's not just that it's polysubstance that we see in postmortem toxicology after overdoses, but rather like the supply itself has a lot of mixed products in it.
Yeah, and that's really concerning. People just have no idea sometimes. I don't think a lot of people even know what Xylazine is, although that is changing because it's becoming more prevalent, and I think there's a lot more media coverage of it, and the federal government's finally taking notice of it. The nitazines too. I mean, and the question is, like, some of these drugs don't seem to respond to things like naloxone or that kind of thing, or could just have completely unpredictable effects. Charlton, can you tell us a little bit about your work with the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition and how drug testing can be a part of that?
Yeah, so, my work with the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition, it brings me, kind of in direct service with individuals who are substance users or impacted by, the adulterants. Our partnership with Nab and his team up there has been invaluable because we've been able to, educate individuals on, what's in the local drug supply. And, sometimes, it resulted in them making better or healthier choices about their drug use. And that's the value of that. We're here, right here in where we're at in Cumberland County in North Carolina. Our partnership with Nab and his team led us to 2 years identify how, the xylazines and the benzodiazepines were and adulterants in our local drug supply. And, it was kind of ignored by some of our local providers and officials, but we were kind of like the Paul Revere's of that being here in North Carolina. But now they're seeing the results of it. When Nab and them, when they first identified these adulterants, we immediately reached out to Philadelphia, where they were dealing with this situation for a couple of years, and we've through our health department, we got some kind of guidance on how they were dealing with it, and I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. We're seeing that it's progressively getting worse here in North Carolina. Some people are starting to prefer what they call the trank dope. We're learning that there may be another level of dependence that that we didn't foresee coming with the xylazine. So and of course withdrawal. I think NAB can educate us a little bit more about the effects of withdrawal from the sedative and the benzodiazepines, because we've had a couple of people go in the hospital and they tried to withdraw without the assistance of medication, and they, started to have seizures similar to, Xanax withdrawal or alcohol withdrawal. So, yeah. So the partnership has been invaluable, in us educating the people who are directly impacted by the adulterant.
Yeah, that's I know it's really scary. Just like the people that are like xylazine can cause these really nasty wounds as well. And it seems like it's a drug that a lot of people want to avoid, but that's really not the whole story. Some people are seeking it out, and I understand why. From what I've heard, xylazine can help fentanyl have legs. One of the biggest problems with these powerful opioids is they're really short acting. So that's basically why people should test their drugs, is so that they can know what they're getting and if they actually want what they're being sold. But I'm really interested in this idea of how it's like drug testing is not just this basic service. It's not just the chemistry or the science. It's also about bringing people together. And Aaron, I think you have a story about this, about, how drug testing encouraged people to come together and create a drug user union. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, and this is something that really I think is different when it comes to whether it's the movement of harm reduction or the fight for drug user health, which is that you have technology that has an impact on culture. And I think it's been rightly said that technology is upstream of culture. And that's really interesting because I think that culture is also upstream of government. So there are pretty broad implications here for how this technology could impact policy, but also groups of people and how people behave. As far as actually organizing people who use drugs, I've found it's always important to have some sort of tangible benefit. People who use drugs are struggling to get by for good reasons. And there are a lot of ways that social functioning has been intentionally hindered and impeded for people who use drugs. And so standing out with a sign and trying to promote your cause isn't always going to get people to organize, especially people who use drugs or just trying to make it in a culture that's really trying to prevent basic social functioning. And so if you don't have something tangible to give people that's immediately beneficial, I think you're going to have a lot of trouble organizing groups of people who use drugs, and for good reason. The harm reduction movement has done this a lot in the past. It's adopted practices that were developed by and for people who use drugs, of exchanging syringes, using sterile supplies, using sterile pipes. And the harm reduction supplies that have emerged in the past have a distinct difference from drug checking that I think is important. And the key difference there is that you can pretty much do anything related to harm reduction, with the exception of drug checking, without being a person who uses drugs. You can hand out syringes that are sterile. You can hand out cookers, pipes, wipes, cookers, cottons, whatever. And you can be a person from the outside who's never touched a drug in your life, but it's probably not going to be the case that you're sitting there with the actual drugs and checking them for quality and vouchsafing their quality, unless you're at least involved in circles of people who use drugs. And the reason for that is you're immediately engaging in an outright illegal behavior. Yes, syringe services are illegal in some states, but you can count on drug possession being pretty much illegal in most places. And so we, as a community of drug user activists, have come to see this as something that can't be taken from us by anyone, public health, the institution of harm reduction. And there's something special about that because it has to be by us, for us, to be done correctly. That's one of the things that I've appreciated about NAB's approach to this. And it was one of the things that really brought me into the fold working with him, because he had already been working with the Urban Survivors Union and the North Carolina Survivors Union to empower people who use drugs to conduct checking, which I think is a pivotal practice. And that's not actually something that's common among researchers. It's actually very common for researchers to come from outside of the drug using community and sort of exploit the expertise and experience and knowledge of people who use drugs in the interest of personal gain or the pursuit of tenure or in the pursuit of professional aspiration. And then the drug using community just kind of gets left in the background and continues to struggle, is rarely compensated at a commensurate level. And a lot of drug checking, if it's to be done properly, has to leverage the expertise and skills of people who've survived the drug war for many years. And I felt that NAB's program was doing that. So I latched right on and started doing some things down here in Texas, where I'm working to build a drug user union. And this has really helped because Texas is so spread out geographically. And it was just going to be hard to have an on-site mass spectrometer or on-site equipment for people to bring their drugs to be checked. You have a lot of windshield time to get from one place to another in Texas. And by and large, the state just isn't ready to invest in anything like that politically, organizationally. And so the mail order thing worked really well. And it has worked really well for getting people involved. And we've gotten samples from cities that are hours and hours drives apart from each other that we otherwise wouldn't. And we've been able to ascertain certain things about the drug supply, our initial hypothesis. And we started working with the University of Texas, some friends over there, to ask whether or not fentanyl or tar was prevalent, and also whether those two substances were being combined. And we actually found that depending on the route of delivery, one or the other substance was more available. And it's actually quite a rare instance that tar heroin without fentanyl in it is even available anymore. That seemed to be traveling through the seafaring routes, whereas the land-based routes continued to increase in fentanyl content. That was actually a very limited pilot, and we have plans to be much more expansive with looking at all substances. And I've been going through a lot of these kits, and I'm really grateful to NAB and his team over there for making this available, really just at low threshold to drug user unions, and prioritizing people who use drugs for driving this process and not setting a high threshold for doing that. And so I'm wondering, maybe NAB, if you could talk about, what some of your ideas were around that, how you came to realize that that was a thing to focus on. And then how did you develop strategies to make sure that that's going on?
Sure. I think drug user unions are the next generation of what's going to happen in harm reduction and public health to help people keep safe. And bringing people with lived experience not in as partners, but as the drivers of these interventions is, it just seems like the obvious right thing to do. We make our service free, available to all drug user unions in the country. And just like kind of building off of Aaron, your experience in Texas, we've had drug user unions in 3 other states get started because we were able to provide this service. And it gave something for like a informal group of people to kind of coalesce around and have like specific questions that they can answer. And so empowerment is definitely like the main point of what we're doing. And it's been really fascinating because watching some of the unions and other groups, they'll take the kits and use them for their own purposes, but won't necessarily tell us exactly what the results are. And we're not a research study, we're a service. And so we're totally fine with that. So an example is out in Nevada, there was a group of drug users who wanted to find out if black lights could be used to detect xylazine or fentanyl in the drug supply. And they didn't tell us like what colors were fluorescing which way or what, but we just tested the samples blinded, gave them the results, and they were able to kind of inform their community as to how true that myth or, that street belief was or wasn't. And it's cool that they didn't tell us, like it's fine. It's like their local contacts, like they do what they need to do with the data, and we'll just objectively tell you kind of in the most scientifically rigorous way what's in there, and you all make the call.
Do black lights help?
I actually don't know. They didn't tell us. And that's, and it's like, and we asked, we were kind of curious what the answer was, but their response was like, look, this is specific to our drug supply, so it may or may not be relevant anywhere else in the country, and people should just do the experiment and figure it out and see if it's relevant for them at that moment in time. And we respected that kind of, it's like, it was so cool to see the research paradigm get flipped on its head, right? And like have the people who use drugs be the ones who keep the knowledge, and us in the research community being like, oh yeah, shit, cool, all right, you got a point.
That's really cool. It kind of makes me think about really the deficit of knowledge that's always existed among drug using communities. And it's kind of always just been assumed that if a person takes drugs, they should just take what they get. And really no care has been applied to ensuring the quality of product or the quality of the substance that a person ingests, because the assumption is there that if you break the law, well, you should be stigmatized and you should probably not know what's being put in your body, and you get what you bargained for because of that. And back to what Troy was saying about autonomy and bodily autonomy. And yes, it is turning things on its head. So technology, I guess, is, helping us to find a way to reverse the conversation around bodily autonomy for people who use drugs. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and this technology has been like so wrapped up in the criminal justice system for so long that, we're actively trying to liberate it. And I'm curious, like Charlton, like when you first started doing the drug checking in Fayetteville, like how did people respond? Like, were they suspicious? Because, like this evidence gets used to lock people up, right? So I wonder like how you all manage that on the ground.
Well, through our activities and syringe exchange and stuff like that, we build up a certain level of trust. And, we've been, doing what we call the integrated harm reduction model here in Cumberland County for a while, where we are doing post-overdose response, and we're doing lead activities, which is law enforcement assisted diversion. So we've built up quite a bit of credibility as far as in the community, as far as, with our participants and stuff like that. And the suspicion came from, the law enforcement officers, and people in public officials. They were like, well, how are you getting these samples? And, and what's going on? So we had to educate them on how we, the solution, it dilutes the samples and makes it inactive or, ineffective, and how, we are doing a public service as far as, being able to educate people on because they had there was a lot of stigma associated with fentanyl. Like police officers, they were thinking like, hey, if I touch a little bit of fentanyl, or I'm gonna, overdose and die. And that fentanyl were being people were putting fentanyl in marijuana and stuff like that. So we were able to through our education and partnership with you guys, and learn kind of debunk some of the stigmas around fentanyl itself. But with these adulterants, they were like, they didn't believe what we were saying until we started, getting permission from participants, getting, taking pictures of their wounds, and then start developing, partnerships with infectious disease doctors and medical professionals to treat these individuals. Because when they went to the hospital, they were like stigmatized, and they were like, okay, this is a result of your choices and stuff like that. And we just kind of, educating them on, why would you treat someone who's coming to you with an addiction differently than you would treat someone that's coming to you that was diabetic, and they're getting, they have to get their foot amputated or something like that because they haven't been, compliant with medical recommendations. So, we're making some inroads. We still got a long way to go, but we're making some inroads as far as educating people and debunking some of the stigmas around why people are choosing to make these choices. So I think that we need to definitely double down on how, important that is, that people make decisions. And, through getting knowledge, it's strange how, like, they said that art imitates life, but we're seeing how life is imitating technology. Technology kind of, dictates how we live now. And through information that we get through technology, we kind of, formulating the way we live. So that's kind of a strange dichotomy.
Yeah, thank you. I want to kind of talk about this practically. If people listening to this, they should test their drugs, because you never know what's in them. I mean, even if you have somebody that you've been using as a source for drugs for years, like, things change, and people that sell drugs often don't know what they're selling. So, but it seems like, mailing in samples to something can take a while. Some people may not want to wait that long. But we also have, like, at-home testing kits, but they're very limited sometimes. You can buy these whole chemistry sets, basically, that can tell you what's in or something or not in something. But it's not going to give you the full spectrum of what's in there, like a mass spectrometer will. To get to a question here, though, I'm wondering about how practical it is to use fentanyl test strips. I hear this a lot in the harm reduction community, that they're like, basically, fuck fentanyl test strips. They're useless. You should just basically assume that if you're doing dope, there's fentanyl in it. But I'm not sure I totally agree with that stance. I think there is some utility for these things. And now they're coming out with other test strips for, like, Xylazine and stuff like that. But I've heard that there can be a lot of false positives with some of those too. So it's so really complicated. But what is some, like, practical advice that we can give people when it comes to this kind of thing?
I think that, the practicality with fentanyl test strips is, like, for instance, if someone's not a opioid user, or they're not using fentanyl, and they they may be using cocaine or methamphetamine or something like that, and they haven't built up a tolerance for fentanyl, the risk of accidental overdose if the cocaine or methamphetamine has been adulterated with fentanyl is very high. So if you are, people who are using, people are regularly using fentanyl, they feel like fentanyl test strips are useless. But people who are maybe using other, like, stimulants or cocaine or methamphetamine, it may be very practical for them to test their drugs.
Yeah, and that's been one of and you mentioned the Xylazine test strips too, and that's been one of the uses of the mail-in drug checking that we've noticed over the last couple months. Is as those strips came online, there were questions about like which manufacturer is better, or is there variation between the different lots and batch numbers of the strips, and like how, like how much dilution do I do? Like, does it work? Is my protocol here at this, is that working or not? Like in a harm reduction program. So we've had multiple programs from around the country kind of do their own experiments on that, where they'll test, they'll get a bunch of test strips, test it, and then send it off to us for like kind of the gold standard verification of what's in there and whether xylazine or fentanyl is in there. And then, in some of those programs, like there was near perfect concordance, and in others it was like 50% were not going the right direction. And so in those programs that had some limitations, they went back and like figured out whether it was the way that they were using the test strips or whether it was the wrong kind of test strip. Because there's a lot of places online that you can buy these test strips, and there's a lot of pretty shady companies making sub-quality test strips out there. So it is worth like kind of keeping an eye on that. So that's been, that's really been the coolest part about the drug checking as far as we've been concerned, is like seeing how people use the technology to answer their own questions. And, like most of those questions are not things that we would have anticipated ahead of time. And so letting people have that autonomy to answer their own questions. So like one example was sex workers in a rural part of the South were concerned that some of their clients were putting roofies, putting sedating drugs into their supply to take advantage of them. And so they systematically tested the samples from their clients and figured out who they should avoid and made like a do not call back list kind of thing. And so, there are kind of these instances that are happening when you let people have access to technology and just step away and let them figure out what's best for them. I think that's the coolest thing about the drug checking. What you said, Troy, about like the different types of drug checking, I think there's like, the way I think about it is there's 4 levels. So you have like the test strips is number 1. Number 2 are these reagent kits. These are like the chemistry kits you talked about, where you drop like multiple, like different chemicals, and they turn different colors onto the drugs. And based on like the pattern of those colors, you can figure out by process of elimination what it is. And then you have these machines called FTIR machines, which are like the size of a toaster oven, and those produce results in about 10 minutes or less. And those are great for drop-in centers, point of care. Some of them are mobile, so you can put them on vans. So I think that's like really like kind of where we should be putting a ton of effort as like to get more of these FTIR machines up and running. And then at the high end of the time and cost are the lab-based programs like ours, where our turnaround time is anywhere from a couple of days to 2 weeks, depending on how complex the sample is. And that's not the kind of situation where people are going to be waiting around for 2 weeks before they, decide whether they should use the dope that's sitting in front of them, right? Like that's just not realistic. And I think kind of the use cases we've seen have been just much more, have been like different from what has come before. I think that's like what differentiates the way that drug checking is happening in the United States versus kind of the way that it has been done in Europe and in Australia and Canada, where a lot of that has been at festival scenes. And at festivals with these point of care machines, right, you're catering to a younger audience that is usually more white, usually more well off financially, and are mostly looking at psychedelics. So it's a bit of a constrained space, right? And then whereas like when we're talking about street opioids and everything that's coming in there, then it's like a much more complex kind of setting to be in. But kind of, really like letting people lead. Like another example is like we get requests from widows. That is something that we totally didn't anticipate, where someone who, sorry, this is hard to even talk about, but someone whose partner may have been a stimulant user who died suddenly of an overdose, and they didn't know what happened. And they had the pipe that they were using, and we were able to test it for them and tell them if it had fentanyl in it or not. And it was a way for them to get closure on their partners passing in a more timely manner than waiting 8 months for an autopsy report to come out. So we've had multiple examples of that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. The program down in Texas, just to go back to the test strips and the wrapper reagents, people thought that xylazine was starting to show up in the drug supply here. And so we had some xylazine test strips that kind of served as, just an early warning, not to make strong assumptions based on it. And then we'd send off to the lab for confirmation. But with all the tests that we ran, we tried to get in a test strip as well, just to test for the efficacy of those strips themselves, to see whether or not we could rely on them. But being able to get the results back on xylazine being here was really important, because we were able to spread the word throughout the community, because no one it was actually kind of bizarre, because there were news reports of it before it had ever been tested for. And I think that's something to keep in mind here, which is that the only other way to get this information is for people to either die or be arrested. And we don't want that. I don't think anybody who listens to this show really wants that. So I guess the next step, or the next question in hand, is to figure out how best to do this. And in that vein, there are some questions that arise around legality. I know with fentanyl test strips, there have been challenges with legality. The state where I live, they nearly passed, but were blocked by one of the representatives here. It's been a continual situation where the strips have not been legalized and they're still technically considered paraphernalia. How do you guys toe the line around that with these test kits?
So we have had a lot of legal review. We're at a major university, and this is not something that flies under the radar. And we believe we are in full compliance with federal laws and state and local laws when it comes to drug paraphernalia and testing equipment. And so, there's a lot of little things we have to do behind the scenes, like maintaining licenses and other things. So we feel like our kits are completely above board, and we've been very public about what we're doing. And, we've had inspections and legal reviews, and had to do risk assessments and all sorts of things. But yeah, it's like a different kind of, once the vial has a liquid in it called methyl cyanide or acetonitrile. And when you put residue amounts of drugs in there, or like a used cotton or something, it becomes unusable by DEA standards. And that kind of takes it away from being a controlled substance. And that's what allows this to continue. Through that, the biggest risk is still going to be on the individual carrying dope around, right? That is never going to go away, and this isn't going to necessarily void that risk. So we feel like the risk to programs and institutionally is very, very low, but individuals are still going to be carrying that risk. So Aaron, what you were saying about the news reports coming out before xylazine had been verified, there's a really good example of this from New Mexico that happened recently, where we use the drug checking not only to figure out what's in the drug supply, but also what isn't in the drug supply. And so there was a spate of overdoses in one particular town in New Mexico, and that happened the same week that the DEA made their national announcement on xylazine. So the local law enforcement and health department immediately jumped to the conclusion that those overdoses were related to xylazine, and that's what caused them. And that particular area in New Mexico, we had been testing their drugs for a while. We knew there wasn't really xylazine in the supply, but we tried to keep an open mind. And that particular harm reduction program, one of the cooler progressive ones, was able to get samples of what was involved in the overdose, send it to our labs. We rushed the testing, got them results in a day, and then they were able to go back and say, hey, look, those samples did not actually have xylazine. It was just a higher dose of fentanyl than usual. And that kind of made the local law enforcement and health department have to change their tune. And they were the health department was on its way to ordering xylazine test strips and kind of creating this educational campaign around xylazine. But that wasn't the problem, right? And so that kind of process would have taken months to play out under normal circumstances. But by being proactive, they were able to, retarget. And what was really amazing, it's like, and we've heard this over and over again, is like, once suppliers know that there is something bad in a supply, we often hear of those batches being destroyed, right? The drugs being destroyed. There was a case out in Western North Carolina recently where someone had tried buying something online, added it to the fentanyl to stretch what they had, and it turned out to be this like toxic mix of nitazines and other stuff that was way different than what they were intending to do. And people started overdosing. We were able to kind of pinpoint which batch it was and what those substances were, and that ended up getting destroyed. Like, how often is it that there is a intervention in public health where you lead to drugs actually being destroyed that are contaminated and bad for health in a way that, we're taking this away, like we're trying to change the narrative that it's not only law enforcement who has the ability to take dangerous drugs off our streets, but through this process of empowerment, we can do it ourselves.
If I might add that, as far as, from a street level view, what we found is that creating adversarial relationships with public health officials and law enforcement, that's not the way for harm reduction. So how we try to get buy-in is to try to, because most people want to see what's in it for them and how can it benefit them. And what we try to do is come from that angle, how we, with these, when people are, having these xylazine wounds and how they're susceptible to secondary infections and like MRSA and stuff like that, how we can, do some early intervention to prevent that can be beneficial to the public at large. And, with law enforcement by, having partnerships with them and convincing them how, our partnership with them can make their job a lot easier, where they're not targeting our, outreach workers and, for, having small amounts of, substance. They know that we're, testing it and, they're not, actually looking to arrest us or find, stop us and search us for, because we collect used syringes that may have, a bit of substance in it. So, in North Carolina, it's legal. But also what we've done here that we thought was pretty cool was because we're in the Bible Belt, and what we've identified and addressed the ecclesiastical community as well, and trying to get them on board, and with education and training on how to use Narcan and overdose recognition and stuff like that. And a lot of them, we've gotten some buy-in from some of the faith community, and so that's made things a lot more palatable for them, when instead of the radical, this is only fair, this is what we do, and you should accept it. We try to get them to, understand how it's beneficial to everyone, the whole community at large.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, Charlton, because I've always thought that, if harm reduction is going to succeed, it needs to convince people that need convincing in order to get on board. Otherwise, it's just facing an uphill battle. But that brings up a couple of questions that I think could be cool to discuss as well, which is, as we start to bring in people from public health or from law enforcement into some of these practices, what are some of and then just even in a broader sense, what are some of the potential unintended consequences of drug checking, and how can we work to mitigate those? I've seen, for instance, like compensatory models of drug checking where people get paid to submit their results, and there are different opinions about that. There are different opinions about how to go about that. And then there are different ideas about how to track data and who to report data to and what to do with that information, whether to make it public or not. So can we have a conversation about the law of unintended consequences and how it applies to drug checking and how we can make sure and protect it as a useful practice.
Yeah, I love the tough question, and I think it's something we have to talk about. One of the big unintended consequences is drug scheduling, right? Like we find novel substances in the drug supply that end up, catching the attention of the lawmakers and others, and they, criminalize that substance and increase the penalties. And I think that's kind of the most standard, one of the big standard concerns. And so we're like, we made the decision at the outset of our program to make all of our data public, because we're a public university, and also because we've always done science this way in my team before drug checking even became a reality for us. We've always published our code and our data as much as we could. And so we kept doing that, and we had the infrastructure to do it. And I fully respect and understand other programs who don't want to share the data in that way because it's their knowledge, it's their community. And talking with our colleagues at the Urban Survivors Union, like we were kind of following their lead on that, where we were, the belief was that this information has been locked up for so long and put behind, classified markings on documents that make it so that people who use drugs don't ever understand what's in drugs until it's too late, right? Like you said, when people are dead or they're arrested. So we wanted this information to be public as soon as possible. So we update our site daily with our results. We are concerned that people are going to, when we look at the practicalities of the scheduling process, like it's never like based on just one case report here or there. It's like there has to be some kind of substantial amount of things happening for that scheduling to happen. And to be honest, like we rarely find stuff that has never been seen before. I think like what we're seeing with Xylazine, like there's bills in front of Congress right now trying to put Xylazine into Schedule 3 from being unscheduled. And when you look at kind of the rhetoric for justifying that, it's the strongest proponents of that have been actually DEA saying like, we need this to be scheduled not only because then we can interdict packages or whatever, but also because we need data. We want data. We want data. And so part of what, I think it's a real risk of having our drug checking data, not just our programs, but just as a large community to be twisted into purposes that we don't approve of. But I don't really know how to mitigate that other than to have like strong data use agreements and other stuff in place, and set community expectations and standards. Curious what you all think too.
Yeah, I appreciate that because this whole conversation really pushes back against this narrative that drug users don't care about their health and that, people are just going to put whatever they want in their body, and that giving people naloxone is just prolonging the inevitable, this horrible, disgusting attitude towards people. But you give, in my experience with a lot of people, if you give people a little bit of respect and you show them that they can care about their health, they will take that further. And if they know what's in their drugs, yeah, they'll throw them out maybe, or use less or something like that. But you're right that this data can be weaponized, and that is a huge concern. Like you said, I don't think making Xylazine scheduled, any level of being scheduled, will help. I think there's no evidence that anything being scheduled has ever made the drug war safer for people. And if they were to put Xylazine in Schedule 3 or Schedule 1, what is probably most likely to happen is that Xylazine would sort of disappear from the drug supply, or at least be reduced, but another adrenergic receptor agonist, some kind of analog of Xylazine that's even more dangerous or even more unpredictable, could start showing up. And that's sort of the thing with the nitazines too. I think this is a whole class of drugs that is starting to emerge more and more. Some of them sort of appear and then disappear, but it's becoming, as far as I can tell, a little bit more popular because there's been so much pressure on fentanyl and the precursors and the whole industry of that. So I can see this data being weaponized. And this brings me to this idea of wastewater drug testing. I did a story for Vice several years ago on this. It's a very, very interesting concept, in my opinion, where you're taking wastewater, you're testing it for drugs, and you're able to kind of like extrapolate that to a community. And there's been so many different pilot studies that have done this, and it's a very effective technology. You can really learn a lot about what people's drug use is like from testing the wastewater. The problem is it's not really consensual, and it can be used as a way of policing certain communities and not others. And we've seen it with so many different examples of certain communities getting policed more than others, even though drug use is pretty uniform across the board. So I wonder how you feel about this idea of wastewater drug testing, because it is becoming more useful. For example, BioBot Analytics, this company that was testing the wastewater for COVID for most of the pandemic, they were, finding signals of the virus. Well, they lost their contract with the CDC. A Google startup thing it took over. They have the contract now. BioBot still wants to survive. They still need to make money. So they've really pivoted to drug testing. And it really does come down, in my opinion, to how they their relationship with law enforcement and how this data is used. Because drug testing can be a bellwether. We can find drug substances before a lot of people start getting hurt by them or something like that. We can kind of like figure out where the winds are blowing. But if that's used in a way that's going to just make things a little bit more difficult for people that use drugs, I see that as a serious issue.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So my dad's a wastewater engineer, so we grew up talking about this kind of stuff at home all throughout my childhood. And so there's some the reality and the promise of wastewater drug testing is really not connected. So the first thing is when you do wastewater, there's a lot of other shit in that sample, right? And so it's very hard to do what's called an untargeted search, an open-ended search, where you're looking for anything that could be out there, because there's going to be all kinds of medicines that you've taken and peed out, right? That's going to be in there, and it's going to be it's a very messy space. And so as an early detection, early warning, that's never going to be the place where you see things first. It might be a place where you see signals or hear about substances elsewhere, and then you can go and try to see if that specific thing is in there. But developing those assays and stuff with a very messy matrix like wastewater, it takes time, and it's got a lot of nuance to it. For our program, our number one requirement is that the results have to be provided back to the individual who donated the sample. And if that's not happening, we're not interested in working with y'all. And so for wastewater testing, it doesn't adhere to the principles that our program espouses. I'll tell you one quick story about wastewater drug testing in central North Carolina, and this was pre-COVID-19 pandemic. There was a fairly wealthy town that decided to do it. They got some little federal grant to pilot it, and they piloted it. They were like, this is still like in the pills era, prescription opioid era, and they ended up having to shut down the program because of pressure from the wealthier parts of town, because the data were showing that it was like the rich people who had the higher levels of drug use and the more kind of worrying patterns of what they were using. And so that public pressure killed that program.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is all making me think about how subordinate everything that we do is to criminalization, and how no matter how advanced we get and what new processes we come up with, they're always going to be under the umbrella of people's attitudes about drugs and the people who use them. And there's a philosophical paradigm of asking whether knowing what something is tells us what it ought to be. And it's an ancient question of is ought, is knowing what something is telling us what it ought to be. And it's most often the case that science is just giving us straightforward information, and humans are taking that and doing what we will with it based on our cultural inclinations. But I'm one of those idealists who's convinced myself that it's always better to know what's true, as uncomfortable as it may be, than to believe a delusion or a falsehood. And it may take a long time. There's this saying that the arc of time bends toward justice. But, this is kind of bringing me to a couple of more questions, which is, since this thing has gained a foothold and it seems to have real utility, and it seems to point towards safe supply. I mean, obviously it's a gesture in that direction, and it doesn't supplant or replace safe supply. What does the future of drug checking look like? What is the ideal scenario here, and where do we hope that it goes, and what do we hope that it looks like in the future?
Yeah. Let me just comment on a point that you made about the data. Because some of the, like you mentioned, some of the data, when it's come out in a official capacity, it kind of determines, what's important or what's a priority as far as policy is concerned. And, and in my experience, we at harm in NCHRC, we collect data like overdose reversals. Let's use that for an example. In our state, they put out state data about overdose reversals, and they get those numbers from emergency management services and lower law enforcement. And then what we do, as far as us being a part of a task force that is at the table with these entities, we get to juxtapose our data, the data that we collect, and and juxtapose that to the data that they are putting out publicly. And the data for overdose reversals, or the amount of Narcan is used, our data usually dwarfs their numbers. So we're able to give them some perspective on how really important, Narcan use and overdose reversals are in the community, because with their data, they kind of minimize that. They this is, these are the numbers. It's bad, but it's not really that bad. But our numbers show that, this is something that we continue to need to have a focus on, so that's just one, area of, as far as our, us being able to compare our data to the data that's being put out publicly. So, and I think that, that accentuates the importance of harm reductionists, people like you and people like me and people who are in the, the drug user coalitions, being at the table, having a voice, being heard. Because if we're only reporting our numbers to ourselves and underground, that's not really getting out there and giving people a true reflection of, what's really out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is a good place to start wrapping up. But I will say this conversation has been great, because it really does challenge the idea that drug testing is just like somebody trying to figure out what's in their drugs so they can just get high and, obliterate themselves or something like that. It really is about like empowering themselves and empowering their community. And I love that example that you gave, Nav, of the sex workers, figuring out, and even just people trying to know a little bit more about what happened to their loved ones who overdosed and died. It's more than just the data. This is not just like soil samples or testing stuff for pesticides or mold or something. It's I don't know. I think this is a good foundation of public health, is to let people know what's in their drugs. And if the government's not going to do it, if they're not going to regulate this stuff or give us a safe supply, which really, I mean, we haven't really talked about that, but this whole conversation is really screaming safe supply, safe supply. I interviewed Dana Larson recently for Salon, and he has that website, getyourdrugstested.com. It's a program in Vancouver. It's a drug testing service. And I asked him what his motivation is in, opening magic mushroom shops and all this stuff. And he's like, I just really want to fund this program but eventually he wants to see it go out of business. He doesn't want to have a drug testing program anymore. He wants it so that it's not even necessary. And so, yeah, I do think this whole conversation is a lot more than about the drugs. It's a lot more than about drug testing. It's about how, people can view their own health and their relationship with their community.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that most of us have an inkling that drug use is far more common than folks assume. The problem is that research right now is based on people who use drugs that meet the criteria for a substance use disorder. And that's not a very large percentage of the population of people who use drugs. And that's a problem. If you want to do science, you want to know what the average person looks like. And practices like drug checking, if they can be democratized across anybody who takes drugs, we're now broadening the scope of figuring out what does drug use actually look like in America. And I don't think we've begun to look in that direction yet. I think most of the assumptions about drugs and the people who use them are very narrow and biased. And it creates a set of cultural attitudes that are not representative of the actual experience of people. So programs like drug checking programs, I think, hold the promise of being able to allow us to recognize just how human the experience of drug use is, how non-pathological it is, if we can begin to respect the same rights as everyone takes for granted. None of us expects when we buy something from the store for it to be anything other than what we purchased. And we've grown up taking all of those rights for granted. And why not extend those same rights to everyone else who uses drugs?
Yeah, I love what you said, Charlton, about like taking charge of the conversation, right? Of having our voices be a big part of how people are understanding what's going on with drug use. I'll just point out that like people have been testing drugs with their own bodies forever, right? For millennia. And so in some ways, like what we're doing is not that radical. We're just adding another slice of technology to it. And even in the United States, drug checking has a history going back to the 60s and 70s. Like there were papers on festival drug checking, like right after Woodstock, being published in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? So it's like some days it feels groundbreaking, but other days we're just we're just continuing on and adding just one more layer of technology to this and lowering the threshold for people to access that technology.
Agree. And I want to personally thank you, Nab, for, the work you and your team do. It's been invaluable service to our community. And I see a lot other communities. So, hopefully, I like the humanizing people who use drugs. Your work goes a long way in doing that. We're people who use drugs. We're not just, addicts or, people on the fringes of society that needs to be thrown away, lepers or whatever. We're human beings, and, we're mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers. I like what the other gentleman said about, only a small portion of people who use drugs meet the criteria for substance use disorder. You know what I'm saying? So, your work continues to be important, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. It's all you guys, couldn't really. I think that's what Aaron said, right? This is like one of those interventions that you can't do without people who use drugs and without people who have trust in from their communities. So we're just here to help you with the technology. All
right. Well, thank you both so much for coming on the show. Dr. Nabarun Dasgupta, Charlton Roverson, where can people find you on social media or online?
We can just say, like, for us at least, like if there's drug user unions, harm reduction programs, health departments who want to do the mail-in drug checking, streetsafe.supply, we'll send you 5 free kits. Test it out, see if you like it. It's free within North Carolina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And to anyone listening to this, go out and get your drugs tested.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Narco Media. Co-hosted and co-produced by Zachary Siegel, Troy Farah, Christopher Maraff, and Aaron Ferguson. I'm your co-producer, Aaron Ferguson. If you like the show, You can find out more at narcocast.com and support us by joining our Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/narcotica. We are excited to announce that a portion of the proceeds from the show will now go toward the Urban Survivors Union, which is the National Drug Users Union, a group of directly impacted advocates for drug user health in America. This is the way social change happens from the ground up, and we are so excited to support this group that is doing such important work to fight stigma against people who use drugs. If you're a patron, you also get free stickers which are personally mailed to you. You can also request a shout out on the show. And now patrons can even get 30% off of merch in our new store, which is at narcocast.myshopify.com. We have t-shirts and coffee mugs, one that says "There are drugs in here," which is awesome. More stuff will be added soon. As always, we are so grateful to the folks that make this show possible. A little goes a long way, so thanks for making Narcotica happen. We're ad-free and we want to keep it that way. If Patreon just isn't for you, that's fine. You can help us out by spreading the word. Tell all your friends about the podcast, advocating for social justice and abolishing the drug war. You can also rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Our theme music is by Glassboy, and Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica. Additional music is by myself, alias Nomad1, drug-using producer. Well, I guess that's all. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Until next time.